Hey folks, welcome to chapter 4 on carbohydrates. I think this is the point in the textbook when things start getting really interesting. Lots of practical applications, you start recognizing foods you actually eat, and of course, carbohydrates are the first of the macronutrients, meaning they have calories like proteins and fats. This is what we'll be covering this chapter, and I just want to remind everybody that the narrated PowerPoint is a helpful tool, but you definitely have to still read the book. So I'll go over quite a few topics from the book and flesh out a few ideas, but the entire scope of what you need to know and more expansive detail is in the textbook. So make sure you read it in addition to listening, watching this PowerPoint. Well, I love to joke that this chapter contains the meaning of life, and in a certain kind of way it does. If we think, what does all life on Earth depend on? What's at the bottom of the food chain? Keep those questions in your mind for a minute here, and we'll get to the answer. The secret to life on Earth, in terms of a biological answer, one could make a good argument for it being photosynthesis. So the sun's energy catalyzes the reaction between carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and water in the soil to form glucose. And you can see this represented here, the sun's energy flowing out, hitting the leaves of the plants. That drives the reaction that takes the water and the carbon dioxide and forms glucose, which is really at the base of the food chain. So where do carbohydrates occur in our food supply? You can take a look at this chart and see that we have a lot of carbohydrates in certain starchy vegetables near the bottom of the graphic, like corn and potatoes. One medium potato has about 30 grams of carbohydrate. That would be 120 calories, right? 4 calories per gram. A cup of corn has even more, a little bit over 40. And those foods are mostly carbohydrate, as are the grains and foods made out of grains, like whole wheat bread or spaghetti. And it's important to note that doesn't mean they are only carbohydrates. So potatoes contain a little bit of protein, corns contain a bit more protein, also contain a little bit of fat. Similarly, grains have some protein, tend to be very low in fat. You get the fruits, which are almost entirely carbohydrate. They have pretty much no fat, except for a couple of fruits that have large seeds, but fruits generally don't have fat and generally just have trace amounts of protein. And you work your way up and you see that a lot of the animal foods don't have any carbohydrates. So something like chicken breast, beef, salmon, no carbohydrate. Eggs have a little bit. Dairy products, depending on the kind of dairy product, might have a little bit, like yogurt and milk, but fermented cheeses do not have carbohydrate. The bacteria that ferments the milk eats up the carbohydrate. That's the food for the bacteria. And then you can go to the very top of the chart and you see corn oil and olive oil. Interestingly, corn and olives have carbohydrate, and you can see corn actually has a lot of carbohydrate, but an oil is a refined food. We're pressing corn and olives under a lot of pressure and sometimes heat, and we're just extracting out the oil from that, so it's 100% fat, there's no carbohydrates. So if you look at like a really classic lunch, just say a turkey sandwich with veggies and a small bag of Utz potato chips, that meal would be about 60 grams of carbohydrate. The way that breaks down is roughly each slice of bread is somewhere between 15, 20 grams of carbohydrate. The chips, about another 15 grams of carbohydrate. And then there's a handful of carbohydrates in the veggies. Now, if a typical meal might be 60 grams of carbohydrate, a typical diet and a 2,000 calorie diet would have somewhere between about 225 to 325 grams. So you could think if you eat 3 meals a day, each having about 60 grams of carbohydrate, that'd be 180. You have a couple of snacks in there, maybe a beverage or two that contains carbohydrates, and you're easily in the 250, 300 or so gram calorie range. Gram range, which would put you in, somewhere around 1,000 calories. So animal foods have no carbohydrates except for milk and a few products made out of milk. Animals store extra energy as fat, including humans. We have a little bit of stores of carbohydrate, but most of our extra energy is stored as fat. Plants, on the other hand, plants store extra energy mostly as carbohydrate, sometimes as fat in certain plant foods, nuts and seeds, and a few other plant foods, but they mostly store extra energy as carbohydrates. Plants release oxygen, animals breathe out carbon dioxide, so there's a lot of symmetry in nutrition, as well as symmetry in the macronutrients. Oftentimes, carbohydrates get a little bit of a bad reputation, and this is really due to refined carbohydrates. And it's important to note the difference between whole and refined carbohydrates. So if you think of something like fresh ears of corn, that's unrefined carbohydrate. Now you can take that corn and you can mash it up and bake it and put it through extrusion machines and create corn flakes, maybe add some sugar and salt to it, and you go from a unrefined carbohydrate to a refined carbohydrate. Similarly, you can also make corn syrup out of corn. That's a bit more of even more of an industrial process involving big machines and enzymes and all sorts of food science processes to create the corn syrup. The corn syrup would be very much of a very refined carbohydrate, a sweetener very similar to sugar, whereas corn, again, is a whole food. Corn is mostly water, there's some fiber in it. You eat 2 ears of corn, that might be 150 calories or so. You feel pretty full. It takes you a while to chew and digest that corn. You can get 150 calories of corn syrup very quickly, just in a sweetener in a drink or a dessert or something. And similarly, a bowl of cornflakes you can plow through pretty quickly. Probably don't feel full that long with 150 calories of cornflakes. Another way to put it would be on the simpler level, things like oranges and orange juice. If you think of a small glass of orange juice pictured there, like maybe, that might be about 10 ounces. That's about the juice of 3 or 4 oranges. So even though it's a very simple refining process, you can drink that orange juice very quickly, maybe 150, 60 calories of fructose mostly, simple sugar found in fruit, whereas taking the time to peel and chew 3 or 4 oranges is a far longer process and you feel a lot more full. So that's one of the big differences between whole foods, in this case unrefined carbohydrates, and refined carbohydrates. How long does it take to eat? How full do you feel from it? Those are important concepts in nutrition. And specifically, one carbohydrate we talk a lot about is sugar. which is a relatively modern food, especially in the quantities we're consuming it. Sugar did not become common and did not become inexpensive till the 20th century. In a lot of parts of the world, it didn't become common until the later half of the 20th century. So, if anyone's ever bought sugar cane somewhere, sugar cane, you can chew through several feet of sugar cane. It takes a long time, and you're still not consuming very many calories because it's mostly water and fiber. Of course, if you refine the sugar cane, you can consume a whole lot of sugar and very quickly, right? The important nuts and bolts of nutrition, knowing the monosaccharides. These are things that you just have to commit to memory. So a saccharide means a sugar, so monosaccharides are one sugar. So you see in the case of glucose, which is the main energy currency of the body, it has 6 carbons. The carbons are right where the little junctures of the hexagon meet. We'll take a look about that in more detail. And then there's a 5-carbon fructose. Those are the monosaccharides, and in different combinations they form disaccharides. So these are the simple sugars. Classification of simple sugars is pretty simple. If it's a mono or disaccharide, it's a simple sugar. If it is a polysaccharide, meaning there are more than 2, so 3 or more saccharides linked together, it's a polysaccharide. And there are 3 kinds of polysaccharides: starches, fibers, and glycogen. We'll go into detail on all of this shortly. A bit more here on disaccharides. So maltose, for instance, has 2 glucose molecules linked together. And you can see where they're linked there that there's an HO and an H. So when the molecules join together, a water molecule is involved. It's added, and that forms the bond. When they split apart, that's called a dehydration reaction, and the molecule of water leaves, the molecule of H2O. So maltose is very common in grains, and if you ever kind of chew on barley or any wheat product like bread or rice, that kind of mild sweetness, that's maltose you're tasting in your mouth. Sucrose is also just called table sugar, so that's a glucose along with a fructose. Again, has that water molecule in there. And then lactose, that's the principal disaccharide that is in dairy products. Looking here at the more complex saccharides, more complex carbohydrates. So there are 2 different kinds of starch, and foods can be a mixture of both, amylose and amylopectin. Amylose is unbranched, so that takes a lot longer to break down. You can see it only has 2 ends, so the enzymes that digest our macronutrients need to go at the end of the molecule to begin the process. So the amylopectin is branched and has a lot of ends, right? So the enzymes can get in at any of those end units and start breaking down that starch quicker. The other 2 things we're looking at there are glycogen and cellulose. So glycogen is how animals store carbohydrates. So in our liver and our muscles, we have a fair amount of glycogen, and it's a little bit similar to amylopectin looking, but slightly different structure. But you can see it's highly branched because we want to be able to break that down quickly if we need energy, because glucose is the major energy currency of our bodies. Cellulose is an example of one of the kinds of ways that plants store extra energy. And it's just one kind of fiber. There are lots of different arrangements of fiber. And humans cannot break down fiber. So we don't have those enzymes to break down that fiber, but fiber plays a very important functional role in health. We'll get to that in a little bit. This is another way of really looking at the same thing, the different kinds of polysaccharides. You have starch, glycogen, and fibers. The oligosaccharides, that's kind of in between the simple carbohydrates and the complex carbohydrates. So oligosaccharides are 3 to 9 units long. Poly is anything longer than 9. So let's follow carbohydrate digestion, starting in the mouth. And a lot of folks forget that the mouth is a really important organ of digestion, and chewing carefully and slowly really helps with digestion of all the nutrients, and certainly carbohydrate, because we break up the food into smaller and smaller surface area, and that helps enzymes get at the nutrients. So starch digestion begins in the mouth, and you have salivary glands secrete saliva into the mouth, and you have salivary amylase in that saliva, and that can start breaking down starches. And in fact, if you chew a piece of bread, or for instance crackers in your mouth for even just a little bit longer than normal, a lot of people don't chew much, so you chew for maybe 10-15 seconds, you'll start noticing that bread or cracker starts getting sweeter and sweeter as it's in your mouth, because you're breaking down already some of those carbohydrates into maltose. So our digestive tract, almost all the parts of the digestive tract are involved in digesting carbohydrates. We talked about the mouth. The stomach is actually not involved in digesting carbohydrates, so we'll skip the stomach. Carbohydrates spend time in there, but no digestion happens there. From the stomach, the carbohydrates go into the small intestine, and that's the main organ of digestion, and also that's where the absorption happens. So where you see the ASE, that, like sucrase, lactase, maltase, amylase, those are all digestive enzymes that work on, just the obvious carbohydrates that they refer to: sucrose, lactose, and maltose. The final product is monosaccharides, right? So we break down all the polysaccharides, oligosaccharides, disaccharides, and we end up with monosaccharides, and they can go right into the bloodstream. The very last part of our digestive tract, the large intestine, also plays a role in carbohydrates. That's where fiber ends up, and we do actually digest a little bit of fiber in our large intestine, which is fermented by bacteria in the colon, and we can get some energy out of it, but most of it passes through us undigested, which sounds like kind of a waste, but it isn't. We'll talk about that in a little bit. This slide sums up what we've been just talking about, but it also gives a great little detailed window into the absorption process. So digestion and absorption are very different. Digestion is all the processes that happen to break down food into as small molecules as possible. When those molecules are very small, then they can be absorbed into the body. So we don't consider the digestive tract, the cavity or lumen of the digestive tract, actually in the body, because it hasn't, the nutrients haven't passed over into the inside of our body. The digestive tract is kind of a tube within a tube, you could think of. It's in our body, but it's also in a way not in our body. So where nutrients pass over into our body, the absorption process, that happens mostly in the small intestine, at the brush border of the small intestine, where you see that those little kind of fingers right there. That's where the monosaccharides actually enter our bloodstream. Here's another view of that same process. So we have the monosaccharides right there at the brush border of the small intestine, and they enter there. Then they can travel along in our bloodstream, where some get picked up, but most end up in the liver. And in the liver, the galactose and fructose are converted into glucose. And also we'll convert some excess carbohydrate into glycogen right there in the liver as well, and in our muscles. The last kind of carbohydrate, which we haven't discussed yet, is fiber. So fiber does not contribute calories, and we don't digest it. Most of it passes through. We can ferment a little bit in the large colon, but fiber is incredibly important for our digestive tract health, and as well as it does lower the risk of diabetes and all sorts of cardiovascular disease. We'll talk about some of that here and some of that in later chapters. In order to discuss fiber, it's important to discuss whole grains versus refined grains. So if you look at a grain, and this could be, for instance, wheat, or it could be rice, it could be whatever kind of grain. Grains all have a endosperm, germ, and bran. Refined grains are just the endosperm, which is just carbohydrates. So the bran is removed, that's where the fiber is, and the germ is removed, which has some valuable nutrients in it. And you might ask, well, why are we eating refined grains? Well, they store a lot better, they cook quicker, and people like the flavor a lot. But as people interested in nutrition and public health, we need to point out that whole grains are a lot more nutritious. Just grains that have fiber, fruit has fiber, and vegetables have a lot of fiber. The most per calorie actually is in vegetables. But regardless of what kind of food we're talking about, where the fiber is coming from, there are two kinds. There's insoluble fiber, which is on the bottom there, or mostly insoluble in something like grains. And then you have soluble fiber, also called viscous fiber, and there's a bit more of that in fruits. But we'll show a chart showing kind of the spread. Most foods that have fiber contain some of both, but viscous means it forms a gel. One of the big benefits of fiber is surprisingly simple. Literally, that takes up space. And a lot of foods that are high in fiber are also high in water. Think fruits and vegetables and whole grains, which soak up water during the cooking process, and legumes as well. Beans, split peas, lentils soak up a lot of water, have a lot of fiber in it. These high fiber foods take up a lot of space in the digestive tract. There is a great deal of benefit for this, for the feeling of being satisfied with a meal. The higher volume, and also literally the chewing. Fibrous foods take a little bit longer to chew, and they certainly take longer to digest. Your digestive system really has to work on them, and the longer your digestive system is working and filled with high volume, high fiber foods, the more you feel full for, the longer you feel full for. So this is a considerable benefit. The other big effect is that your digestive tract is lined with muscles. So eating a high fiber diet essentially is like a workout partner for the muscles of your digestive tract. Like if you can picture lifting dumbbells works out your biceps. So That high fiber keeps the muscle tone firm and in good shape in your digestive tract, which is beneficial for long-term digestive health. Kinds of fiber have a little bit different effects, both super important. The soluble fiber will form a viscous gel, and that helps slow down glucose absorption in the blood. It also binds cholesterol, so it lowers our cholesterol numbers because our body then has to pull cholesterol out of the blood to make bile. Cholesterol is the main ingredient in bile, which helps digest fat, which we talk about next chapter. But so lowering cholesterol is a really important role of soluble fiber. And insoluble fiber also adds bulk, which we talked about the importance of, and it helps promote bowel movements in the large intestine. It also has a scrubbing action and kind of keeps the digestive tract clean, we could say. So we'll take a look at two slides here going over the sources of fiber. And you'll notice that some of these foods aren't as common in the American diet, right? We don't eat a lot of legumes, we don't eat a lot of whole grains, and we generally have a fairly low vegetable and fruit intake. And the average American is consuming somewhere around half of the recommendation for fiber. And that's one of the reasons we have a lot of digestive problems in this country. So this is looking at soluble and insoluble fiber, and you see every food that is high in fiber has both. So you don't really have to worry too much about, oh, I need my insoluble fiber here, my soluble fiber here. Just eating a fiber-rich diet, you'll get plenty of both. This is a little bit of a tangent, but I think it's so fascinating. There was a doctor in mid-20th century England named Dr. Dennis Burkett, and he's kind of you could say, the father of fiber in nutrition in a way. He worked both in England and he worked a lot in Uganda, which at the time was a colony of Great Britain. And he worked a lot with digestive complaints. And in England, there was a great deal of, he was working with constipation, hemorrhoids, diverticulitis, colon cancer, which is now understood that essentially with a long-term low-fiber diet, the waste material stays in that large intestine too long. The waste material has some mild toxins in it, and when you have that kind of long-term constipation, it's really bad for the large intestine and can increase the risk of cancer. Anyhow, so in England, he had a lot of patients with digestive complaints. Then he'd go work in Uganda, and he'd have very, very little digestive complaints with his patients there. And one thing he did was measure, he measured two things: the transit time, which is the amount of time it takes a food from entry to exit. So you eat a meal and then you excrete out when you go to the bathroom the waste products from the meal after your body has absorbed the nutrients, but quite a bit later, right? So the transit time, and there are different ways you can study this. Nowadays, a lot of scientists use food dyes, but yeah, you could actually just eat a meal with corn in it, and just eat one meal with corn in it, and don't eat several meals with corn in it. And since corn will show up in the stool because there is a completely inedible part of the corn, you can measure your transit time. And you can see here the Ugandan villagers had a pretty modest transit time. They were eliminating the waste from a meal about 3 hours after eating that meal, whereas the British subjects had a much slower functioning digestive tract. It was taking almost twice that amount of time. in the 60s, right? 65, 66, right around twice the amount of time to break down that same meal. So that is unhealthy for the digestive tract to take so long to do that. And that suggests maybe that the tone of the muscles in the digestive tract isn't as good, but it's directly related to the amount of fiber in the meal. So the British were eating much more refined foods, refined carbohydrates, more sugar, more meat. The Ugandans were eating a lot more plant foods, a little less meat, probably not much dairy. I'm not 100% sure on that, but a much higher fiber diet. The other part of the study, which might sound a little disgusting to you, but Dr. Dennis Burkett was weighing the stools, so weighing, the waste material. So instead of going to the bathroom in a toilet, these test subjects would collect their stool, and it would get weighed. And the Ugandan stools were weighing over a pound. A pound's about 454 grams. They're up close to 500 pounds. And the British subjects had a far smaller stool, only about 100 grams, so one-fourth the size. So um, there's less fiber in it, less water in it, and that's not healthy. What does a healthy stool look like? So the classic dietitian reference is a light brown fluffy banana. All right, I'll leave you with that lovely thought. Okay, now that we've introduced the concept of transit time, you can see here some average transit times. Fiber content, more fiber will slow transit time in the beginning, which is great because that makes you feel more full. Your food spends a little more time in the mouth, quite a bit more time in the small intestine, which is great. You feel a bit more full, and actually less time in the large intestine because there's quite a bit of material there, and that's promoting a bowel movement, and that's good. That means less constipation. I should mention when you increase the fiber in your diet, it's really important to also increase water intake as well because the fiber will soak up some of that water. Um, Physical movement also helps promote bowel movement. So if you're very sedentary, that can contribute to some constipation. And there are many different medications that um, can impact transit time one way or the other. Stimulants, things like caffeine, cigarettes, any kind of drug that is stimulating, those tend to promote shorter transit times and actually can lead to some malabsorption. You don't want too short transit times. Laxatives can do that too, which isn't great because if you're promoting bowel movements before your body has absorbed all the nutrients, you can end up being somewhat malnourished. And then there are quite a few medications, including like quite a few painkillers, like opiate painkillers, that make you more constipated, that delay bowel movements. Up fiber. Um, Fiber increases the weight and volume of the stool. So larger, softer stool is easier to pass and promotes more peristalsis, which will give you healthier GI muscle tissue, which is great for the long-term health of your digestive system. And this is more of an area of research, but there's a lot of research that fiber can really help the microbiome of the digestive tract. So keeps your healthy bacteria high, which is really good for the digestive tract's long-term health. And we mentioned a couple other of these things. We have a whole other section on diabetes and another narrated PowerPoint on diabetes. I'll leave that topic for that PowerPoint. And I think the rest here has been covered. Okay, so in summary for the carbohydrates, One, make sure you watch also the diabetes narrated PowerPoint, or read through that PowerPoint. And of course, read the chapter. These narrated PowerPoints are just kind of to help flesh out some different topics, but not a substitute for reading the chapter. And make sure you know the AMDR, basic functions of carbohydrates. It's the preferred fuel for the brain, red blood cells, and the heart. Understand how carbohydrate digestion works, and understand the sources of carbohydrates. And in terms of the fuel source, blood sugar, that's all covered in the other PowerPoint on diabetes. Okay, thanks for listening/watching.